They called her just a cashier at SportMax, the kind of quiet girl who counted change and restocked shelves without making waves. But when armed robbers stormed the hunting goods section demanding weapons, Arlo Collins did something that left everyone speechless. She assembled a tactical shotgun in 4 seconds flat, chambered a round, and neutralized the threat before security even knew what was happening. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. If you're enjoying this, don't miss out. Subscribe now for more. What they didn't know was that this unassuming European girl had a past that would make seasoned professionals look like amateurs. The morning shift at SportMax began like any other Tuesday in suburban Denver. Arlo Collins adjusted her name tag for the 3rd time, smoothing down the edges that never seemed to stay flat against her uniform vest. At 23, she stood behind Register 4 with the same quiet efficiency she'd maintained for the past 18 months, her accent barely noticeable unless customers listened carefully to her soft "thank you" and "have a nice day." The sporting goods store buzzed with its usual pre-noon activity. Customers browsed fishing tackle, examined camping gear, and debated the merits of various hunting rifles displayed behind locked glass cases. Arlo processed their purchases with mechanical precision, scanning barcodes, counting bills, making change. To her coworkers, she was invisible furniture, the reliable girl who never called in sick, never complained about overtime, and never caused drama. Manager Derek Harrison barely acknowledged her existence beyond the necessary work communications. "Collins, we need a price check on the Coleman lanterns," or "Collins, clean up the spill in aisle 7. She responded with a simple nod, completed the task, and returned to her station without fanfare. Her coworkers had long since stopped trying to draw her into conversations about weekend plans or workplace gossip. Arlo seemed content to exist in her small bubble of routine and solitude. What they couldn't see was the way her eyes tracked every customer who approached the firearms counter, how she mentally cataloged the weapons on display, noting their specifications, their mechanisms, their capabilities. When hunting enthusiasts discussed their preferences within earshot, Arlo absorbed every detail about ballistics, range accuracy, and tactical applications. Her colleagues assumed she was daydreaming or lost in thought, but Arlo was actually conducting a continuous assessment of the store's inventory and security protocols. During her lunch breaks, while others scrolled through social media or chatted in the break room, Arlo sat alone reading technical manuals she'd purchased from the store's book section. Firearms maintenance guides, tactical training materials, ballistics handbooks, she devoured them all with the intensity of a graduate student preparing for finals. When asked, she claimed it was just curiosity about the products they sold. Her explanation satisfied her incurious coworkers, who returned to their conversations about reality TV and weekend plans. The truth was far more complex. Arlo Collins wasn't just another retail worker killing time between paychecks. Born in Prague to a family with deep military connections, she'd grown up around weapons the way other children grew up around toys. Her father, Colonel Viktor Kolar, had trained Czech Special Forces before the family immigrated to America when she was 16. Her uncle operated a private security firm that specialized in high-risk corporate protection. Family gatherings didn't feature board games. They featured field stripping competitions and tactical scenario discussions. But Arlo had chosen a different path after high school, deliberately distancing herself from the family business. She wanted normalcy, wanted to prove she could succeed without trading on her family's reputation or specialized knowledge. Working at SportMax was her declaration of independence, her attempt to build an identity separate from the tactical expertise that had defined her childhood. The irony wasn't lost on her. Surrounded by the very weapons and equipment that represented her past, she played the role of ordinary retail employee with almost theatrical dedication. When customers asked her technical questions about the merchandise, she deflected with practiced phrases like, "Let me get someone from sporting goods to help you," or "I'm just a cashier, sir." Her coworkers interpreted this as appropriate humility.
They had no idea she could have provided more detailed information than any specialist on staff. As Tuesday morning progressed into afternoon, Arlo processed sale after sale with the same quiet efficiency. Fishing licenses, ammunition purchases, camping supplies, each transaction was handled with professional courtesy and complete anonymity. She was exactly what every retail manager wanted: reliable, unobtrusive, and utterly forgettable. The security cameras captured her routine movements, the cash register recorded her transactions, and her coworkers barely registered her presence. In every measurable way, Arlo Collins was just another cashier working just another shift at just another sporting goods store. The kind of employee who blended into the background so completely that people forgot she was there. That invisibility would soon become her greatest advantage.
The dismissal was subtle but constant, woven into every interaction Arlo had with her coworkers and customers. It wasn't malicious. Most people at SportMax were decent enough, but it was absolute. In their minds, she occupied the lowest rung of the retail hierarchy, someone whose opinions didn't matter and whose potential didn't exist. Derek Harrison embodied this attitude perfectly. During the monthly staff meetings, he would discuss inventory issues, security protocols, and customer service standards with the department specialists, while Arlo and the other cashiers sat in the back, expected to listen but never contribute. When she'd once suggested adjusting the placement of certain high-theft items based on patterns she'd observed, Derek had smiled condescendingly and said, "Thanks, Collins, but let's leave the loss prevention strategy to people who understand the big picture." The sporting goods specialists were equally dismissive, though in different ways. Jake Morrison, who managed the firearms section, treated her like a child who might hurt herself if she got too close to anything dangerous. When customers asked technical questions that required someone from his department, Jake would stride over with exaggerated authority, often explaining things Arlo already knew in excruciating detail. "This is a semi-automatic rifle," he'd say, as if she'd never seen one before. "Very different from what civilians usually understand." Customer interactions followed predictable patterns. Men especially seemed incapable of believing that a young female cashier might possess any knowledge about the products they were purchasing. They'd ask for help selecting ammunition or accessories, then immediately request someone who actually knows about this stuff when she began to respond. Even when she provided accurate information, they'd insist on confirmation from a male employee. The age factor compounded the problem. At 23, Arlo looked even younger, and her soft-spoken demeanor reinforced assumptions about her inexperience. Customers regularly asked if there was an adult who could help them with significant purchases. When she processed hunting license applications or firearms transfers, they'd express surprise that someone so young was authorized to handle such responsibilities. Her accent, faint though it was, added another layer of dismissal. Americans seemed to find European accents either exotic or suspicious, and in the context of a sporting goods store in suburban Colorado, customers often assumed she didn't understand American gun culture or outdoor recreation. They'd speak slowly and use simple words, as if her foreign birth somehow prevented her from comprehending basic concepts about products she'd grown up around. The female customers weren't much better, though their dismissal took different forms. Soccer moms buying camping gear for family trips would ask for someone more experienced to explain tent specifications. Women purchasing personal protection items would request female specialists, assuming that Arlo's youth and retail position disqualified her from understanding security concerns. Even the part-time employees, college students working weekend shift, treated her with benign condescension. They saw her full-time cashier position as evidence of limited ambition or capability. "At least you have job security," one had commented, as if working retail was the extent of her potential. They discussed their majors, their internships, their plans for careers that would take them far from places like SportMax, while Arlo remained silent about her own background and capabilities. The most frustrating aspect was how her deliberate self-limitation reinforced their assumptions. By choosing to work at SportMax, by deflecting technical questions, by maintaining her quiet demeanor, she'd created a perfect disguise that had become a prison. Every day, she watched less knowledgeable employees provide incorrect information to customers while she bit her tongue and processed transactions. The security protocols particularly galled her. SportMax's anti-theft measures were laughably inadequate, their emergency procedures outdated, and their staff training minimal. Arlo could see dozens of vulnerabilities that a determined criminal could exploit, but her suggestions for improvement were politely ignored or dismissed as unnecessary paranoia from someone who watched too many action movies. During quarterly performance reviews, Derek would praise her reliability and customer service skills while making it clear that advancement opportunities were limited. "You're great at what you do, Collins, but management requires a different skill set. Maybe someday you could move up to customer service supervisor, but that's probably a few years away." The message was unmistakable. Stay in your lane, keep your head down, and don't aspire to anything beyond your perceived capabilities. Arlo had created this situation by choosing anonymity over recognition, but living within those constraints day after day was slowly suffocating her professional soul. She watched younger, less experienced employees receive promotions to departments where they could barely distinguish between different types of ammunition. She observed customers make potentially dangerous equipment choices based on advice from specialists who'd learned everything they knew from YouTube videos and manufacturer brochures. The gap between her actual capabilities and others' perceptions of her had grown so wide that bridging it seemed impossible. She was trapped by her own success at being unremarkable, defined by limitations that existed only in other people's minds, but felt as solid as prison walls.
What her coworkers didn't see were the small moments that revealed Arlo's true capabilities, hidden in plain sight, like Easter eggs waiting to be discovered. During inventory counts, while others relied on printed lists and calculators, she mentally tracked hundreds of items with perfect accuracy. When Jake Morrison struggled to remember the specifications for a customer's special order rifle, Arlo would quietly slide him a note with the correct model number and technical details, letting him take credit for the information. Her break time activities went far beyond casual reading. The technical manuals she studied weren't just theoretical curiosities. She was conducting comprehensive analysis of every piece of equipment in the store. In a notebook she kept locked in her car, Arlo maintained detailed diagrams of weapon disassembly procedures, ballistics calculations for various ammunition types, and tactical assessments of the store's layout that would have impressed military strategists. During slow periods, when customers browsed without immediate needs, Arlo's eyes followed different patterns than her coworkers. While they watched for shoplifters or counted minutes until their next break, she was conducting security assessments. She'd identified 17 potential breach points in the store's perimeter, calculated optimal firing positions for various scenarios, and mentally cataloged which displays could provide cover during emergencies. The most telling moments came during equipment demonstrations. When Jake showed customers how to field strip popular rifles for cleaning, Arlo would watch from her register position, timing his movements and noting inefficiencies in his technique. His 3-minute disassembly routine could be completed in 45 seconds with proper training. His reassembly, which sometimes required multiple attempts to align components correctly, reflected fundamental gaps in his understanding of the mechanisms. Customer questions often revealed the limits of the official specialist's knowledge. When hunters asked about long-range ballistics or competitive shooters inquired about precision modifications, the responses were frequently inadequate or incorrect. Arlo would overhear these conversations while processing transactions, internally composing detailed explanations that would never be shared. Her silence wasn't modesty, it was strategic camouflage.
One particularly revealing incident occurred during a busy Saturday rush. A customer had purchased an expensive tactical scope, but returned an hour later claiming it was defective. Jake examined the scope for 20 minutes, testing various adjustments and declaring it faulty. As he prepared paperwork for a manufacturer return, Arlo noticed something others had missed. The customer had installed the scope rings backwards, creating mounting issues that mimicked mechanical failure. Rather than embarrass Jake publicly, she waited until the customer left, then quietly demonstrated the correct installation. Jake was grateful, but attributed her knowledge to beginner's luck rather than expertise. The pattern repeated regularly. Arlo would identify solutions that eluded the official experts, then find diplomatic ways to share information without challenging the established hierarchy. Her physical capabilities were equally hidden. During stock rotation, when heavy boxes needed movement between storage areas, Arlo would volunteer for tasks that left her male coworkers exhausted. She'd developed loading techniques that maximized efficiency while minimizing strain, but her methods looked effortless rather than skilled. Coworkers assumed she was naturally strong rather than trained. The firearms section's monthly inventory provided the clearest glimpse of her true abilities. While Jake and his assistants laboriously counted and recorded each weapon, Arlo would complete visual sweeps that identified discrepancies instantly. Missing items, misplaced accessories, incorrect tags, she spotted everything, but reported only the most obvious problems, careful not to appear more capable than the specialists. Her relationship with the store's security systems revealed another layer of hidden knowledge. The surveillance cameras had numerous blind spots that Arlo had mapped with precision. The alarm systems had vulnerabilities that could be exploited by anyone with basic technical knowledge. The safe where high-value items were stored used a combination lock with factory default settings that had never been changed. She knew all of this, but kept the information to herself, understanding that revealing such awareness would raise uncomfortable questions about how a cashier had acquired security expertise. Perhaps most significantly, Arlo had been conducting her own threat assessments of customers and situations. Her training in behavioral analysis allowed her to identify potential problems long before they escalated. She'd spotted shoplifters that security cameras missed, recognized signs of straw purchases that violated federal firearms laws, and identified customers whose agitation suggested potential violence. In each case, she'd found subtle ways to alert appropriate personnel without revealing her analytical capabilities. A casual comment to Derek about a suspicious customer would prompt additional attention. A suggestion that Jake might want to double-check certain paperwork would prevent illegal transactions. Her interventions appeared intuitive rather than professional. The most dramatic example had occurred 3 months earlier when a customer's behavior triggered every alarm bell in Arlo's tactical training. His questions about store security, his interest in employee schedules, his assessment of response times for local law enforcement. Everything suggested reconnaissance for a potential robbery. She'd managed to delay his purchase with technical questions while quietly alerting management, who increased security presence until the threat passed. Nobody connected her observations to the prevention of a potential crime. The customer had simply changed his mind and left as far as anyone knew. Arlo preferred it that way. Her greatest strength was being underestimated, and every successful intervention while maintaining her cover was practice for whatever real test might come.
The culture at SportMax operated on an unspoken hierarchy that placed cashiers at the absolute bottom, treated more like equipment than employees with potential. This wasn't unique to their store. Retail establishments everywhere functioned on similar caste systems, but the sporting goods context made the dismissal particularly pronounced. In a world of outdoor expertise and technical knowledge, being just a cashier meant being irrelevant to everything that mattered. Derek Harrison embodied the management attitude that kept people like Arlo in their designated boxes.
During staff meetings, he'd distribute information based on perceived need-to-know levels. Department specialists received comprehensive briefings about new products, security updates, and company policies. Cashiers got basic customer service reminders and schedule changes. When Arlo once asked about new inventory arriving in the firearms section, Derek's response was swift and dismissive. "That's not your area, Collins. Focus on what affects your register." The message was clear. Curiosity beyond your assigned role was inappropriate, even suspicious. This created an environment where intellectual isolation was enforced as rigorously as any physical barrier. Arlo was expected to scan barcodes and count change, nothing more. Any demonstration of broader knowledge would be seen as overstepping boundaries rather than showing initiative. Jake Morrison, the firearms specialist, was particularly territorial about his domain. He'd worked at SportMax for 5 years and treated his position like a military rank that demanded respect. When customers asked questions while Arlo was processing their transactions, Jake would physically insert himself into conversations, often interrupting her mid-sentence to provide his own explanations. "Let me handle this," he'd say, as if customer education was beyond her capabilities. The irony was painful for Arlo to witness. Jake's knowledge was encyclopedic but shallow, derived entirely from manufacturer specifications and internet forums. He could recite statistics about muzzle velocity and effective range, but his understanding of practical applications was theoretical at best. When customers asked about real-world performance or tactical considerations, his responses revealed gaps that Arlo could have filled effortlessly. Customer interactions reinforced the hierarchy daily. Middle-aged men purchasing hunting equipment would address their questions to male employees, even when Arlo was the only person available to help. When she'd attempt to provide assistance, they'd ask to speak with someone who knows about this stuff, as if her gender and position automatically disqualified her from understanding outdoor equipment. The assumptions were particularly pronounced with firearms-related purchases. Despite handling hundreds of such transactions, customers regularly expressed surprise that a young woman was authorized to process their paperwork. "Are you sure you know how to do this?" they'd ask, watching nervously as she completed federal background check forms they'd filled out incorrectly. Some would request confirmation from male staff members, unable to trust that she understood the legal requirements. Female customers weren't immune to these biases. Women purchasing personal protection items would often ask to speak with female specialists, assuming that Arlo's cashier position meant she lacked relevant experience. When she'd try to provide basic information about pepper spray or personal alarms, they'd request someone more qualified to explain safety considerations. The part-time college employees created their own form of condescension. They saw full-time retail work as a dead-end job for people without better options. Their conversations around Arlo were filled with references to internships, career prospects, and academic achievements, delivered with the subtle superiority of people who knew they were just passing through. "At least you don't have student loans to worry about," one had commented, as if financial simplicity compensated for limited ambition. Even well-meaning attempts at inclusion carried undertones of dismissal. During holiday parties or employee appreciation events, Arlo was praised for her reliability and positive attitude, qualities that sounded more appropriate for describing a loyal pet than a capable professional. Nobody mentioned intelligence, initiative, or potential for growth. The most insidious aspect of this environment was how it trained everyone, including Arlo herself, to accept limitations as natural and permanent. When she deflected technical questions or claimed ignorance about products she understood completely, she was reinforcing the very stereotypes that confined her. Each act of self-diminishment made the next one easier, until playing the role of simple cashier required no conscious effort. The security briefings provided perfect examples of this institutional blindness. Management would discuss theft prevention strategies and emergency procedures with department heads, while cashiers listened passively, expected to follow protocols they hadn't helped develop. When Arlo noticed obvious flaws in these procedures, escape routes that could be blocked, communication systems that could fail, response times that assumed ideal conditions, her observations were unwelcome. Her suggestions, the few times she had offered them, were met with patronizing explanations about why her concerns were unfounded. "Don't worry, Collins. We've had security consultants design these procedures. They know what they're doing." The idea that a cashier might have relevant insights was literally inconceivable within the existing framework. This dismissive environment created a perfect storm of underestimation. Arlo's colleagues saw her as harmless background presence. Customers viewed her as a necessary inconvenience between them and real expertise. Management considered her a reliable but replaceable cog in the retail machine. Nobody imagined that this quiet European girl possessed capabilities that would make their security consultants look like amateurs. The blindness was so complete that it had become her ultimate camouflage. In a world where everyone knew exactly what cashiers could and couldn't do, Arlo had become effectively invisible. And in a profession where invisibility could mean the difference between life and death, that dismissive environment had inadvertently created the perfect tactical advantage.
Every night after her shift ended, Arlo Collins drove to an abandoned warehouse district 20 minutes from SportMax, where she maintained a secret that would have shattered every assumption her coworkers held about her capabilities. The industrial complex, largely vacant since manufacturing moved overseas, provided perfect cover for activities that required privacy and silence. In a storage unit she'd rented under a different name, Arlo had recreated a tactical training facility that would have impressed professional military instructors. Weapon disassembly stations, ballistics testing equipment, tactical mannequins for scenario practice, everything necessary to maintain and develop skills that her retail environment couldn't accommodate. The monthly rental cost consumed a significant portion of her cashier salary, but preserving her capabilities was worth any financial sacrifice. Her training regimen followed military precision. 3 evenings per week were dedicated to weapon handling and maintenance. She'd acquired decommissioned firearms through legal channels, stripping them down to component level and reassembling them blindfolded until the process became as automatic as breathing. Her personal record for field stripping an AK-47 was 12 seconds. For reassembly, 18 seconds. Times that would have earned respect from Special Forces operators. The remaining evenings focused on tactical scenarios and situational awareness. Using floor plans she'd memorized from SportMax, Arlo would practice movement patterns, cover positions, and threat assessment procedures. She'd identified optimal responses for 17 different emergency situations, from simple theft attempts to coordinated armed robbery. Each scenario had been rehearsed until her reactions were instinctive rather than conscious. Her intelligence gathering extended far beyond casual observation. Using publicly available resources, Arlo had researched crime patterns in their area, identifying trends that suggested potential threats to retail establishments. She'd studied surveillance footage from other sporting goods robberies, analyzing tactics used by criminals and failures in store security responses. Her database included detailed profiles of local criminal organizations and their typical operational methods. The technical aspects of her preparation were equally comprehensive. She'd acquired advanced ballistic software, using it to calculate optimal ammunition selections for various scenarios. Her understanding of terminal ballistics, bullet penetration, and collateral damage considerations exceeded that of most law enforcement officers. When customers at SportMax asked about ammunition performance, she could have provided analysis that would have amazed them if revealing such knowledge hadn't compromised her cover. Physical conditioning remained a priority despite her sedentary retail work. Early morning runs before her shifts, evening strength training sessions, weekend tactical movement practice, all conducted with the intensity of someone preparing for combat deployment. Her fitness levels were maintained at standards that would have qualified her for elite military units, though her coworkers saw only a thin young woman who occasionally seemed energetic. the psychological preparation was perhaps most crucial. Arlo practiced compartmentalization techniques that allowed her to maintain her cashier persona while staying mentally prepared for action. She developed trigger phrases and emotional switches that could transform her from retail employee to tactical operator in seconds. The transition wasn't just about accessing skills. It was about accessing an entirely different personality designed for high-stress combat situations. Her intelligence gathering about SportMax itself was exhaustive. She documented every employee's schedule, identified their likely responses to various scenarios, and assessed their potential value as assets or liabilities during emergencies. Her coworkers would have been shocked to learn that their quiet cashier colleague could provide detailed psychological profiles of each team member, including predicted behavior under extreme stress. The legal research was equally thorough. Arlo had studied Colorado's concealed carry laws, self-defense statutes, and legal protections for civilian intervention in violent crimes. She knew exactly what actions would be legally defensible and which would expose her to criminal liability. Her responses to potential scenarios were carefully calibrated to remain within legal boundaries while maximizing tactical effectiveness. Perhaps most importantly, she had developed contingency plans for the aftermath of any incident that might reveal her capabilities. She prepared explanations for her knowledge, cover stories for her equipment, and strategies for managing the inevitable questions that would follow any demonstration of her true skills. The goal wasn't just to handle emergencies effectively, it was to do so while preserving the anonymity that made her effective. Her family remained unaware of the extent of her preparation. They knew she worked in retail and assumed she'd chosen a simple, safe career path far from their military traditions. Phone calls home focused on mundane details of cashier life, never mentioning the hours spent maintaining tactical proficiency. This deception protected both her cover and their peace of mind. The financial costs extended beyond equipment rental. Ammunition for practice sessions, technical manuals for study, specialized gear for various scenarios, all purchased through channels that couldn't be traced back to her retail employment. She'd created a completely separate identity for these acquisitions, using legitimate methods that nonetheless kept her preparations invisible to casual observation. The most challenging aspect was maintaining operational security while conducting her preparation. Every movement between her retail life and her tactical training required careful planning. License plates were memorized, routes were varied, timing was randomized. She operated under the assumption that any compromise of her secret activities would end both her anonymity and her effectiveness. This double life created psychological strain that required constant management. During slow periods at SportMax, while her conscious mind processed routine transactions, her subconscious was running tactical scenarios and threat assessments. The mental compartmentalization was exhausting, but it kept her prepared for the moment when preparation would become performance. That moment, she sensed, was approaching faster than anyone realized.
The morning started with another reminder of how completely invisible Arlo had become to the people around her. As she unlocked her register and began her opening procedures, Jake Morrison was regaling Derek Harrison with stories from his weekend shooting competition, describing his performance with the kind of technical detail that Arlo knew was half wrong and completely exaggerated. "My grouping at 300 yards was tighter than anything those other guys managed," Jake boasted, gesturing expansively with his coffee cup. "They kept asking what kind of scope I was using, like equipment makes the difference instead of skill." Arlo bit her tongue, knowing that Jake's 300-yard shooting was actually conducted at an indoor range with a maximum distance of 50 yards, and his tight grouping would have been considered mediocre by any serious competitive standard. But correcting him would require explaining how she knew better, which would compromise the carefully maintained ignorance that kept her safe. The frustration wasn't just about Jake's embellishments. It was about the systematic waste she witnessed daily. Customers left with incorrect information about products that could literally save their lives. Women seeking personal protection were sold inadequate equipment based on gender stereotypes rather than practical assessment of their needs. Hunters purchased ammunition unsuited for their intended game because specialists relied on manufacturer marketing rather than ballistic science. Derek's management decisions were equally maddening. The store's security protocols were based on retail industry standards designed for general merchandise, not specialized equipment that attracted both legitimate customers and criminal interest. Their response procedures assumed threats would follow predictable patterns, giving employees plenty of time to implement careful protocols. Real violence, Arlo knew, happened too fast for careful protocols. The inventory management reflected the same lack of tactical thinking. High-value items were secured based on theft probability rather than operational vulnerability. The most dangerous oversight was the ammunition storage, thousands of rounds organized by caliber and manufacturer, easily accessible to anyone who gained control of the storage areas. A determined attacker could turn SportMax's own inventory into an arsenal within minutes. Customer interactions provided daily reminders of how completely her potential was dismissed. A middle-aged woman shopping for hiking equipment had asked about personal safety in remote areas, specifically mentioning concerns about wildlife encounters. Jake's response had been to recommend bear spray and noisemakers, standard advice that ignored the regional reality of dangerous human encounters in backcountry areas. Arlo had wanted to explain proper situational awareness techniques, discuss the relative effectiveness of various deterrent methods, and provide realistic assessment of response options for different threat scenarios. Instead, she'd process the woman's purchase while Jake delivered inadequate advice that could leave her vulnerable to preventable dangers. The pattern repeated constantly. A teenage boy purchasing his first rifle received generic safety lectures that covered basic handling but ignored the psychological preparation necessary for responsible ownership. An elderly man buying personal protection equipment was sold items based on ease of use rather than effectiveness, potentially creating false confidence that could prove fatal in actual confrontations. Most frustrating were the near-miss incidents that revealed systemic vulnerabilities. 3 weeks ago, a customer attempted to purchase ammunition without proper identification, becoming agitated when Jake explained the legal requirements. The situation had escalated to raised voices and threats before the customer stormed out, promising to return with better treatment. Arlo had recognized the behavioral pattern immediately. The reconnaissance questions, the testing of security responses, and the anger that seemed disproportionate to the minor inconvenience. Everything suggested this was preparation for a more serious attempt, possibly involving accomplices and weapons. She'd tried to alert Derek, but her concerns were dismissed as overreaction to a routine, difficult customer. The security briefing following that incident had been particularly galling. Derek had praised Jake for handling a challenging situation professionally while implementing minor procedural changes that addressed none of the actual vulnerabilities. They'd installed a panic button behind the firearms counter, as if there would be time to press buttons during a coordinated attack. Arlo's suggestions for improved security measures were politely ignored or explained away. Her observation that the store's layout created tactical disadvantages was dismissed as unnecessary paranoia. Her recommendation for basic threat recognition training was deemed outside the scope of retail employment. Her proposal for emergency communication protocols was rejected as too complex for the existing staff. The isolation was becoming unbearable. She was surrounded by people discussing subjects she understood better than they did, but forced to remain silent while they made decisions that could affect everyone's safety. Her expertise was not just unwanted, it was actively discouraged, treated as inappropriate curiosity rather than valuable knowledge. The physical aspects of her job were equally demoralizing. standing behind a register for 8 hours, processing routine transactions, pretending that counting change represented the limit of her capabilities. It felt like intellectual suffocation. Her training sessions at the warehouse became increasingly intense as she channeled frustration into physical preparation, but the double life was creating psychological strain that showed no signs of improving. The breaking point came during a staff meeting where Derek announced new security procedures based on corporate recommendations. The protocols were designed for general retail environments and completely ignored the specialized risks associated with sporting goods inventory. Worse, they actually increased vulnerabilities by creating predictable response patterns that any professional criminal could exploit. Arlo sat in the back row, listening to procedures that would make everyone less safe, while her coworkers nodded approvingly. When Derek asked for questions, she remained silent, knowing that explaining the flaws would require revealing knowledge that supposedly didn't exist. She was trapped between protecting her cover and protecting her colleagues, forced to choose between personal security and professional responsibility. That evening, during her tactical training session, Arlo's frustration transformed into grim determination. She'd maintained her cover for 18 months, hoping that anonymity would provide sufficient protection for both herself and others. But the gap between what was needed and what was being provided was growing too dangerous to ignore. The next serious incident wouldn't be handled by inadequate protocols and good intentions. It would require capabilities that officially didn't exist, skills that couldn't be explained, and action that would shatter every assumption her coworkers held about who she really was. She increased the intensity of her training, sensing that the time for hiding was running out.
Tuesday afternoon brought an unusual calm to SportMax that made Arlo's tactical instincts whisper warnings she couldn't quite articulate. The store felt different somehow, too quiet, with customers moving through the aisles in patterns that seemed oddly purposeful rather than browsing casually. She'd processed fewer transactions than normal, but the customers she had served asked unusual questions about store hours, staff schedules, and security procedures. At 2:47 p.m., while helping an elderly customer select fishing tackle, Arlo noticed two men near the firearms section who triggered every alarm bell her training had installed. They weren't examining merchandise like typical customers. They were conducting surveillance, their eyes tracking employee movements and security camera positions with the methodical precision of professionals planning an operation. The first man, tall and lean with prison tattoos partially visible beneath his sleeves, asked Jake detailed questions about the store's inventory, while his companion, shorter but more muscular, seemed more interested in employee locations and escape routes. Their clothing was wrong for the weather. Heavy jackets on a warm day that could conceal significant weapons. Their behavior was wrong for retail customers. Too focused, too observant, too comfortable with violence. Arlo completed the fishing tackle transaction while maintaining peripheral awareness of the suspicious pair. Her training had taught her to recognize the signs of operational surveillance, and these men were conducting textbook reconnaissance. They were professionals, which meant whatever they were planning would be executed with military-style precision and overwhelming force. When she finished with the elderly customer, Arlo approached Derek's office with the intention of alerting management to the potential threat. But Derek was on a conference call with corporate headquarters, his door closed, and his assistant indicating he shouldn't be disturbed for at least 30 minutes. The urgency, she felt, had no outlet through official channels. Jake was still engaged with the suspicious customers, apparently oblivious to the danger he was helping them assess. His responses to their questions were providing detailed information about security procedures, inventory values, and staff capabilities, intelligence that professional criminals could use to plan devastating attacks. He was essentially providing reconnaissance briefings to potential enemies. Arlo returned to her register position, maintaining visual contact with the two men while processing routine transactions. Her heightened awareness picked up additional details that confirmed her worst suspicions. The shorter man carried himself with the confident posture of someone accustomed to violence. The taller one's questions revealed familiarity with firearms that exceeded casual interest. Both men were conducting their surveillance with the systematic thoroughness of military operators. At 3:15 p.m., the situation escalated beyond reconnaissance into active preparation. A third man entered the store, younger than the others, but carrying himself with the same predatory awareness. He didn't approach the firearms section. Instead, he positioned himself near the main entrance, where he could observe customer flow and monitor approaches from the parking lot. His presence converted their operation from surveillance to active positioning. Arlo's training identified the deployment pattern immediately. A three-man team establishing overwatch, intelligence gathering, and perimeter control. This was military-style tactical preparation, suggesting capabilities far beyond typical retail robbery. These weren't desperate criminals making impulsive decisions. They were professionals executing a planned operation with precision that most law enforcement agencies couldn't match. The realization hit her like cold water. SportMax was about to be attacked by professionals, and none of her co-workers had any idea what was coming. Derek remained locked in his conference call, oblivious to the threat developing outside his office. Jake continued providing information to potential attackers, treating them like valued customers rather than enemy reconnaissance. The other employees went about their routines, unaware that predators were positioning themselves for an assault. Arlo faced a choice that would define not just her own future, but potentially determine whether her co-workers lived or died. She could maintain her cover, continue playing the role of harmless cashier, and hope that her suspicions were wrong or that someone else would notice the danger. Or she could act on her training, abandoning 18 months of carefully maintained anonymity to address a threat that only she had identified. The decision became urgent when the two men at the firearms section concluded their surveillance and began moving toward the exit. They weren't leaving. They were repositioning for the next phase of their operation. In her tactical training, Arlo had recognized the transition from preparation to execution, and every indicator suggested that transition was happening now. Derek's conference call continued behind his closed door. Jake began helping other customers, already forgetting the detailed information he'd provided to the suspicious men. The third man maintained his position near the entrance, no longer pretending to browse merchandise. Arlo calculated that she had perhaps 10 minutes before whatever they were planning would begin. Her training had covered this exact scenario: imminent threat, inadequate official response, operational decision required without higher authorization. The protocols were clear. When lives were at stake and conventional resources were unavailable, tactical personnel were authorized to act independently using whatever capabilities were necessary to protect innocent civilians. But implementing those protocols would mean revealing everything she'd worked to conceal. Her expertise, her training, her true identity. All of it would be exposed the moment she took action beyond her assigned role. The quiet, European cashier who had worked at SportMax for 18 months was about to disappear forever. But the people she'd served alongside for those months might live to see tomorrow. She began moving toward the firearms section, her demeanor shifting from retail employee to tactical operator with each step. The transformation was subtle but complete. Her posture straightened, her awareness expanded, her movements became more precise and purposeful. After 18 months of playing a role, Arlo Collins was about to become herself again. The only question was whether her co-workers would survive the revelation.
At 3:26 p.m., the assault team made their final positioning moves, and Arlo realized she had less than 60 seconds before the attack began. The man near the entrance stepped outside briefly, not leaving but signaling to additional team members or vehicles positioned in the parking lot. When he returned, his jacket was unzipped, providing faster access to whatever weapons he carried beneath. The moment of no return arrived when Arlo noticed the eldest customer, the grandfather shopping with his young grandson, moving directly into what would become the primary kill zone once the attack started. In 30 seconds, that sweet old man and innocent child would be caught in crossfire between professional attackers and whatever desperate resistance the SportMax staff could mount. Derek's conference call continued behind his closed door, the rhythmic sound of his voice discussing quarterly inventory projections while armed professionals prepared to assault his store. Jake was demonstrating the action on a bolt-action rifle for a customer, completely unaware that real weapons were about to be deployed with lethal intent just meters from his position. Arlo's tactical training had covered this precise decision point countless times, the moment when an operator must choose between maintaining cover and preventing civilian casualties. Every scenario had the same conclusion. When innocent lives were at immediate risk, operational security became secondary to mission success. Her mission, whether officially recognized or not, was protecting the people around her. She abandoned her register without explanation, moving toward the firearms section with purpose that would have seemed inexplicable to her coworkers if they'd been paying attention. But they weren't paying attention. They were continuing their normal routines while death approached with professional precision. The firearms display case keys hung on Jake's belt, exactly where they'd been every day for the 18 months she'd worked at SportMax. In a normal situation, taking those keys would require authorization, explanation, and probably disciplinary action. But normal situations didn't involve professional assault teams preparing to execute coordinated attacks against civilian targets. "Jake," she said quietly, approaching him from his blind side while he remained focused on his customer demonstration. "I need the keys to the tactical case, now." Her voice carried an authority that hadn't existed during 18 months of retail interactions. Jake looked up from the rifle he was handling, confusion replacing his usual condescending smile. "What? Collins, you can't access those cases. You're not authorized for firearms handling." "Jake, give me the keys right now or people are going to die." The words came out with flat certainty, carrying implications that made Jake step backward involuntarily. For the first time since she'd started working at SportMax, someone was seeing past her cashier facade to glimpse the professional underneath. "What, are you insane?" Jake whispered, glancing around to see if other customers were witnessing this unprecedented breach of protocol. "I can't just hand over security keys because you're having some kind of breakdown. Get back to your register and I'll pretend this didn't happen." Through the store windows, Arlo could see the assault team's final preparations beginning. Hand signals were being exchanged, positions were being refined, weapons were being checked. In approximately 45 seconds, SportMax would transition from retail environment to combat zone, and Jake was still treating this like a personnel management issue. "Look at the man by the entrance," she said urgently, her voice remaining low but carrying unmistakable command authority. "Watch his movements. Look at his positioning. Tell me what you see." Jake glanced toward the entrance, his retail-trained eyes seeing nothing more threatening than a customer examining hiking equipment. "I see someone shopping. Collins, you're scaring me. Maybe you should take the rest of the day off and we can discuss this tomorrow when you're feeling better." Arlo realized that Jake's complete lack of tactical awareness made explanation impossible within the time constraints they faced. His eyes literally couldn't see what hers saw. The predatory movements, the professional positioning, the coordinated timing that announced imminent violence to anyone trained to recognize such signs. "The keys, Jake. Last chance." Her hand moved toward his belt where the keyring was attached, a movement that caused him to step back further and raise his voice above a whisper. "Don't you dare touch those keys! Derek, I need you out here right now!" Jake's shouts echoed through the store, drawing attention from customers and staff members who had never witnessed open conflict between employees. Derek's office door remained closed, his conference call continuing behind soundproof walls, while his store prepared to become a battlefield. The part-time employees looked up from their tasks, watching the unprecedented confrontation between their quiet cashier colleague and the firearms specialist, with expressions of shock and growing concern. At 3:27 p.m., Arlo made her final decision.
Jake would not provide voluntary cooperation, Derek was unavailable for authorization, and the assault would begin whether or not she had access to appropriate defensive equipment. She could continue following SportMax protocols and watch her coworkers die, or she could abandon those protocols and give them a chance to survive. Her hand moved with speed that Jake couldn't follow, removing the keyring from his belt before he could react. The movement was so smooth and professional that several customers stopped their shopping to stare at what had suddenly become the most interesting development in the store. "Collins, give those back right now or you're fired." Jake reached for the keys, but Arlo was already moving toward the tactical equipment case with purpose that left no doubt about her intentions. "Everyone needs to get down on the floor behind solid cover. We're about to be attacked by armed professionals. This is not a drill." The announcement created immediate chaos. Customers looked around in confusion, unsure whether they'd witnessed an employee mental breakdown or a legitimate security threat. Jake continued demanding the return of his keys while reaching for his radio to call for management assistance. But Arlo was no longer listening to Jake or anyone inside the store. Her attention was focused on the assault team that had just received their final signal and was beginning to move toward the entrance with weapons becoming visible under their jackets. She had approximately 20 seconds to access defensive equipment and prepare for combat. After 18 months of being dismissed as just a cashier, she was about to demonstrate capabilities that would redefine everyone's understanding of what was possible. The transformation was complete. The quiet European girl who counted change and restocked shelves had disappeared forever, replaced by the tactical professional she'd always been underneath.
With the keys in her hand and Jake shouting protests behind her, Arlo moved to the tactical equipment case with fluid precision that silenced the growing commotion around her. Her movements carried an authority that made even the confused customers step back instinctively, recognizing something dangerous and professional in the way she approached the secured weapons. The tactical shotgun she selected was a Benelli M4 Super 90, a weapon she'd studied extensively but never mentioned knowing anything about during her months of retail anonymity. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, unlocking the case, removing the weapon, checking the action with movements so smooth they seemed choreographed. The entire process took less than 10 seconds, a speed that would have impressed military instructors. "Collins, put that weapon down immediately." Jake's voice cracked with panic as he watched his quiet cashier colleague handle military-grade equipment with obvious expertise. "You're not trained for this. You're going to hurt someone." Arlo ignored him completely, her attention focused on combat preparation that required absolute concentration. From the ammunition storage, she retrieved 12-gauge tactical rounds, her selection based on ballistics calculations that would maximize stopping power while minimizing penetration through store walls that might endanger customers in adjacent areas. The loading process revealed the true extent of her capabilities. Each shell was chambered with mechanical precision, her movements flowing like a practice dance between weapon and operator. Shell after shell disappeared into the magazine tube with rhythmic clicking that seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden silence that had fallen over the store. 4 seconds. From touching the weapon to having it fully loaded and combat-ready took exactly 4 seconds. A speed that left Jake speechless and caused several customers to back away from what they were witnessing. Arlo's transformation from retail employee to tactical operator was so complete that people around her couldn't process what they were seeing. "Everyone on the floor now." Her voice carried command authority that cut through confusion and panic, causing immediate compliance from customers who had never heard that tone from the quiet cashier they thought they knew. "Stay behind solid cover and do not move until I give the all clear." The assault team was at the entrance, their weapons now visible as they prepared for final approach. Through the glass doors, Arlo could see professional equipment that confirmed her worst assessments: automatic weapons, body armor, communications gear, and coordinated movements that spoke of extensive training and careful planning. Derek's office door finally opened as the commotion penetrated his conference call soundproofing. "What the hell is going on out here?" he demanded, stepping into view just as Arlo completed her combat preparations.
The sight of his cashier holding a tactical shotgun with obvious expertise left him frozen in disbelief. "Armed assault team at the entrance," Arlo reported, without taking her eyes off the approaching threat. "4 operators minimum, professional equipment and training. Everyone needs to take cover immediately while I establish defensive positions." "You're fired!" Derek shouted, apparently unable to process the tactical situation beyond its violation of employee protocols. "Put that weapon down and get out of my store!" The first attacker reached the entrance doors, pausing briefly to coordinate final timing with his team members. Arlo could see him speaking into a communications device, probably confirming positions and receiving final authorization to begin the assault. The moment of transition from preparation to action was seconds away. "Derek, call 911 and tell them we have armed professionals attacking SportMax. Tell them to send SWAT, not regular patrol units. These aren't ordinary criminals." "I'm calling security to have you arrested." Derek fumbled for his phone, still unable to comprehend that his reality had shifted from employee management crisis to life-or-death tactical situation. The assault began at 3:28 p.m. when the lead attacker kicked open the entrance doors with explosive force that shattered the normal sounds of retail commerce. His automatic weapon was raised and ready as he entered, followed immediately by his team members, who moved with coordinated precision that filled the store's main aisle. But instead of encountering confused retail employees following inadequate security protocols, the assault team found themselves facing something they hadn't planned for: a tactical professional in defensive position with military-grade equipment and obvious combat experience. Arlo's first shot came before the attackers could properly assess their changed situation. The tactical shotgun's roar echoed through the store like thunder, followed immediately by the distinctive sound of a weapon being cycled with practiced efficiency. Her positioning behind the sporting goods counter provided both cover and optimal firing angles for controlling the store's main approaches. The lead attacker dropped instantly, his automatic weapon skittering across the floor as tactical rounds found their target with precision that spoke of extensive training and combat experience. His team members scattered for cover, their coordinated advance disrupted by encountering resistance they hadn't anticipated. "Stay down and stay quiet," Arlo called to the terrified customers and employees who were witnessing their quiet cashier colleague engage in professional combat. "Let me handle this." The second attacker attempted to flank her position by moving through the camping equipment aisle, but Arlo had anticipated the maneuver. Her tactical training included detailed knowledge of SportMax's layout, and she'd positioned herself to control multiple approaches simultaneously. Another shotgun blast echoed through the store, followed immediately by the sound of camping equipment crashing as the flanking attackers sought cover behind inadequate concealment. Arlo's movements between shots were fluid and controlled, each position change calculated to maintain tactical advantage while protecting civilian lives. Derek watched from his position behind the firearms counter, finally understanding that his dismissive attitude toward the harmless cashier had been catastrophically wrong. The woman efficiently engaging professional attackers bore no resemblance to the quiet employee he'd condescended to for 18 months. The third attacker tried to provide covering fire for his remaining team member, but found himself outmaneuvered by someone who obviously understood tactical principles better than he did. Arlo's response was immediate and devastating, her weapon handling demonstrating capabilities that military instructors would have praised. In less than 2 minutes, the professional assault that should have overwhelmed SportMax's defenses had been neutralized by someone the attackers had never considered a threat. The quiet European cashier had disappeared completely, replaced by a tactical professional whose capabilities exceeded those of the criminals who'd planned to rob them. Derek stood in his office doorway, phone in hand, watching his just-a-cashier employee demonstrate skills that redefined everything he thought he knew about the people working for him.
The fourth attacker had taken cover behind the outdoor equipment display, using camping gear and kayaks as concealment while he reassessed a situation that had gone catastrophically wrong for his team. Arlo could hear him speaking urgently into his communications device, probably calling for backup or attempting to coordinate with additional team members positioned outside the store. Her tactical position behind the sporting goods counter provided excellent cover, but limited mobility, and she knew that professional opponents would adapt quickly to her defensive advantages. The element of surprise that had allowed her initial success was gone. Now they knew they were facing someone with legitimate combat capabilities. The challenge intensified when automatic weapon fire began raking the area around her position, forcing her to maintain cover while the remaining attacker advanced through the store using suppressive fire tactics. The rounds were punching through merchandise and display cases with devastating effect, creating a deadly environment for the civilians trapped throughout the building. "Everyone stay down and move toward the back exit if you can do it safely," she called out between bursts of incoming fire. Her voice remained calm and authoritative, despite the chaos erupting around her, a testament to training that had prepared her for exactly this type of high-stress combat situation. Jake had crawled behind the firearms counter, his face pale with shock as he watched the quiet cashier he'd dismissed for months demonstrate capabilities that seemed impossible. "How do you know how to do this?" he whispered during a brief lull in the gunfire. Later, Arlo replied, checking her ammunition count while monitoring the attacker's position through reflections in the store's security mirrors. She had 3 rounds remaining in the weapon and several more shells in the tactical vest she'd grabbed from the equipment case, but ammunition management was becoming critical. The attacker was moving methodically through the camping section, using outdoor equipment for concealment while advancing toward her position. His movements revealed military training. He understood cover and concealment, fields of fire, and tactical advancement under hostile conditions. This wasn't some desperate criminal making panic decisions. This was a professional applying combat skills against what he now recognized as legitimate opposition. Derek had finally managed to connect with 911, but his explanation of the situation was creating confusion among emergency responders who couldn't understand how a retail robbery had become a military-style firefight. "There are people shooting at each other in my store," he kept repeating, unable to provide the tactical assessment that would have helped emergency units respond appropriately. The struggle became psychological as well as physical when Arlo realized the attacker was deliberately targeting areas where customers might be hiding, using terror tactics to force her into exposed positions where his automatic weapon would provide decisive advantage. She could hear crying from the footwear section where the young mother with 2 small children had taken cover, and the sound triggered protective instincts that had been hardwired into her tactical training. "I'm coming for you," she called to the hidden customers, knowing that abandoning her defensive position would expose her to significant risk, but unable to let innocent people remain in danger while she maintained tactical safety. The movement between cover positions tested every skill she'd developed during months of warehouse training. She used merchandise displays, support pillars, and equipment cases to mask her advance while the attacker continued suppressive fire that demonstrated his determination to maintain initiative in the engagement. Her flanking maneuver took her through the fishing equipment section, where she discovered the elderly customer and his grandson huddled behind a display of tackle boxes. The old man's eyes widened when he saw her approaching with a tactical shotgun, but something in her demeanor convinced him she represented safety rather than additional threat. "Can you move to the back exit?" she asked quietly, her attention split between the scared civilians and monitoring the attacker's position through audio cues. The grandfather nodded, gathering his grandson protectively as they prepared to move towards safety. The final phase of the engagement came when the attacker realized his suppressive fire tactics weren't preventing Arlo from maneuvering effectively. He abandoned his methodical advance and charged her position directly, counting on overwhelming firepower to end the confrontation quickly. But Arlo had anticipated the tactical shift, positioning herself where his charge would expose him to devastating crossfire from her final prepared position. When he emerged from cover with his automatic weapon blazing, he found himself facing someone who had turned his own aggressive tactics against him. The engagement ended with a final shotgun blast that echoed through the store like punctuation on a sentence that had been building for 18 months. The last attacker dropped his weapon and collapsed among scattered camping equipment, bringing sudden silence to a building that had been filled with combat just moments before. Jake emerged from behind the firearms counter, his face pale with shock as he watched the quiet cashier he'd dismissed for months demonstrate capabilities that seemed impossible. Derek stood in his office doorway with his phone still in his hand, trying to process how his employment management crisis had become a tactical situation that had been resolved by someone he considered completely unremarkable. But for Arlo, the immediate crisis was over. Now came the harder challenge, explaining how a retail cashier had acquired military-grade combat skills without revealing truths that could compromise both her safety and her family's security. The transformation was complete, but the consequences were just beginning.
The silence that followed the final gunshot felt surreal after the explosive chaos of combat. Arlo maintained her tactical position for another minute, weapon ready, ensuring that no additional threats approached while emergency responders coordinated their entry into what they'd been told was an active shooter situation. The scene that greeted the SWAT team when they finally breached the entrance was unlike anything they'd encountered in routine retail robberies. 4 attackers down, professional weapons scattered across the floor, and clear evidence of coordinated tactical engagement rather than random violence. Most unusual was the sight of a young woman in a SportMax vest, holding a tactical shotgun with obvious expertise. "Weapon down, hands visible." The SWAT team's commands echoed through the store as they established control of the scene. Arlo complied immediately, placing the shotgun on the counter and raising her hands with movements that demonstrated familiarity with law enforcement procedures. "I am the defender," she announced clearly, using terminology that would identify her as friendly to the tactical officers. 4 attackers neutralized, no civilian casualties, scene is secure. The SWAT team leader approached her with caution that shifted to professional curiosity as he assessed the tactical situation. The precision of the defensive positions, the efficiency of the weapon deployment, the controlled nature of the engagement, everything suggested military-level expertise from someone who appeared to be a retail employee. Jake emerged from behind the firearms counter, his legs unsteady as he approached the SWAT officers. "She saved our lives," he said, his voice carrying shock and disbelief. "They came in here with automatic weapons, and she handled it like she'd been doing this her whole life." The elderly customer who'd been shopping with his grandson appeared from the back of the store, tears in his eyes as he approached Arlo. "That young lady saved my grandson," he told the officers. "She could have stayed safe behind cover, but she risked herself to protect strangers." Derek finally found his voice as paramedics began treating the minor injuries sustained during the attack. "I don't understand any of this," he told the investigators. "She's a cashier. She counts change and stocks shelves. How does someone like that know how to do what I just witnessed?" The question everyone was asking became the focus of the investigation that followed. Detective Maria Santos, a veteran investigator with 20 years of experience, had never encountered a civilian defense case quite like this one. The tactical sophistication of both the attack and the defense suggested professional military involvement on both sides. "Miss Collins," Detective Santos said during the preliminary interview, "your actions today were remarkable, but they raise questions about your background and training. Civilians don't typically possess the skills you demonstrated." Arlo had prepared for this moment during 18 months of maintaining her cover. "My family has military background. I grew up around weapons and tactical thinking. When I saw what was happening, my training took over." The explanation was true but incomplete, providing enough information to satisfy immediate questions without revealing details that could compromise operational security. Her family's military connections were verifiable. Her familiarity with weapons was documented through legal purchases, and her defensive actions were clearly justified under Colorado law. The store's security footage provided dramatic evidence of the engagement, showing Arlo's transformation from retail employee to tactical professional with cinematic clarity. The speed of her weapon deployment, the precision of her positioning, the controlled nature of her response. Everything was captured in high definition that would soon be analyzed by use of force experts. News media began arriving within hours, drawn by reports of a retail employee who had single-handedly defeated a professional robbery team.
The story had everything journalists loved: an underdog hero, dramatic action, and a mystery about hidden capabilities that defied easy explanation. The customers who'd witnessed the engagement provided statements that painted Arlo as someone who had risked her own safety to protect others. "She could have hidden," the young mother with 2 children told reporters. "Instead, she put herself between us and those men with guns. I owe my children's lives to her courage." But perhaps the most telling testimony came from Jake, whose months of condescending treatment had been revealed as catastrophically misjudged. "I thought I knew everything about weapons and tactics," he admitted to investigators. "Watching her work, I realized I didn't know anything. She saved lives that would have been lost if we'd followed standard procedures." The tactical analysis conducted by law enforcement revealed the sophistication of both the attack and the defense. The assault team had been equipped with military-grade weapons, communications equipment, and coordination that suggested extensive planning. Their neutralization by a single defender using sporting goods store inventory was unprecedented in law enforcement records. Colonel Rodriguez from the nearest military base was called in to provide expert analysis of the tactical footage. His assessment was unequivocal. The tactical tactics demonstrated in this engagement reflect advanced military training and combat experience. This was not luck or instinct. This was professional-level tactical expertise applied under extreme stress. The media attention grew as the story spread beyond local news to national coverage. Cashier defeats armed robbery team became Mystery Woman's military skills save lives, as reporters attempted to understand how someone working retail possessed capabilities that impressed military experts. Arlo found herself at the center of a media storm that threatened to expose the very anonymity she'd worked so hard to maintain. Interview requests flooded in from news programs, tactical training magazines, and security professionals who wanted to understand her background and methods. Through it all, she maintained the careful balance between truthfulness and operational security that her family had taught her. She was a legal immigrant with military family background who had acted instinctively to protect innocent people. The explanation satisfied legal requirements while preserving the mysteries that kept her interesting to media but safe from deeper investigation. The transformation was complete and irreversible. The quiet European cashier who had counted change and restocked shelves for 18 months had disappeared forever, replaced by someone whose capabilities had been demonstrated under the most dramatic circumstances possible. But as the immediate excitement faded and the investigation continued, Arlo knew that the real challenges were just beginning. Proving herself capable was only the first step. Now she had to navigate the consequences of that proof.
3 days after the attack, Arlo sat in the conference room at SportMax corporate headquarters, facing a panel of executives, legal representatives, and security consultants who were trying to understand what had happened in their suburban Denver store. The meeting had been described as a comprehensive review, but everyone present knew it was actually a reckoning for actions that had saved lives while violating virtually every company policy. Corporate Vice President James Mitchell led the discussion with the carefully neutral tone of someone conducting an investigation that could result in either commendation or termination. "Ms. Collins, your actions during the incident were undoubtedly heroic, but they also raised significant concerns about protocol violations and liability exposure." The legal representative, Sarah Chen, was more direct. "You accessed secured weapons without authorization, engaged in armed combat on company property, and put customers at potential risk by escalating what might have been a simple robbery into a firefight. From a liability standpoint, we're looking at enormous exposure." Arlo had expected this reaction. Corporate entities operated on risk management principles that prioritized predictable procedures over individual initiative, even when that initiative saved lives.
Her unauthorized actions, regardless of their success, represented chaos in a system designed to prevent exactly the kind of unpredictable outcomes she'd created. Detective Santos, who had been invited to provide law enforcement perspective, offered a different view. The tactical analysis indicates that this was never going to be a simple robbery. The assault team was equipped for sustained combat and civilian casualties. Ms. Collins' intervention prevented what could have been a massacre. Derek Harrison, still struggling to reconcile 18 months of mundane employee management with the tactical professional he'd witnessed, provided his perspective with obvious confusion. "I've managed retail locations for 15 years, and I've never encountered anything like this. She was the most reliable, unremarkable employee we had. How was I supposed to know she was capable of this?" The security consultant brought in to evaluate the incident, retired military officer Captain Thompson, had reviewed the store footage extensively. The defensive tactics displayed were textbook perfect for the tactical situation: weapon handling, positioning, threat assessment, civilian protection. Everything was executed at professional military level. This wasn't lucky instinct. This was advanced training applied under extreme stress. The corporate executives exchanged glances that communicated their dilemma clearly. They had an employee who had violated numerous policies, but had also prevented deaths and potential lawsuits that would have dwarfed any current liability concerns. Traditional disciplinary procedures weren't designed for situations where policy violations saved lives. "Ms. Collins, your actions during the incident were undoubtedly heroic, but they also raised significant concerns about protocol violations and liability exposure." "Ms. Collins, your actions during the incident were undoubtedly heroic, but they also raised significant concerns about protocol violations and liability exposure." "Ms. Collins, we need to understand your background and training. Your employment application listed retail experience and basic education, but nothing that would explain the capabilities you demonstrated. Were you dishonest during the hiring process?" Arlo had prepared for this question carefully. "I listed my relevant employment history and education accurately. My family background includes military service, which provided informal exposure to tactical training, but I didn't consider that relevant to a cashier position." The explanation was technically true while avoiding details that could compromise her family's security or her own operational flexibility. Her application had been honest about verifiable facts while omitting information that wasn't legally required and could create complications. Chen leaned forward, her legal training focused on liability mitigation. "The question is whether your undisclosed capabilities created a duty to act that exposed the company to additional risk. If you had training that could have prevented this incident, should you have disclosed that during hiring?" The training that could have prevented this incident was recognition of pre-attack surveillance and threat assessment. I did attempt to alert management about suspicious individuals, but my concerns were dismissed as unnecessary paranoia. Derek's face flushed as he remembered the occasions when Arlo had tried to discuss security concerns, suggestions he'd brushed off as inappropriate for someone in her position. The realization that his dismissive attitude might have contributed to the crisis was clearly uncomfortable. Captain Thompson addressed the tactical aspects with professional interest. "Ms. Collins, your weapon handling and engagement tactics suggest formal military training beyond casual family exposure, special forces level, possibly foreign military background. That level of expertise doesn't develop accidentally." The room fell silent as everyone waited for Arlo's response to what amounted to a direct challenge about her true background. This was the moment she'd prepared for during months of maintaining operational security: how to acknowledge capabilities without revealing details that could compromise safety. "My family immigrated from the Czech Republic when I was 16. In Europe, military service and tactical training are more common in civilian populations than they are here. What Americans consider specialized military skills are sometimes just family traditions in other cultures." The explanation provided context while avoiding specifics that could be verified or challenged. It acknowledged foreign military background without claiming formal service, suggesting cultural differences that Americans might not fully understand. Mitchell consulted his notes before addressing the core corporate concern. Regardless of background, you took actions that exceeded your authority and put the company at significant legal risk. Even if those actions were ultimately beneficial, we can't have employees making independent decisions about when to violate established procedures. Detective Santos interjected with law enforcement perspective. Mr. Mitchell, Colorado law provides clear protection for defensive actions taken to protect innocent lives. Ms. Collins' actions were legally justified and tactically sound. Prosecuting her for policy violations while she was preventing murders would create public relations problems that far exceed any liability concerns. The corporate representatives exchanged more meaningful glances, recognizing the political reality that disciplining an employee who had become a media hero for saving lives would create problems extending far beyond their company. The story had already gained national attention, with Arlo being portrayed as an example of courage and competence triumphing over bureaucratic limitations. Chen posed the crucial question: what happens now? We can't simply ignore the policy violations, but we can't also be seen as punishing someone who prevented a massacre. How do we resolve this situation in a way that protects the company while acknowledging the positive outcome? The answer to that question would determine not just Arlo's future with SportMax, but also how corporate America handled situations where individual competence exceeded institutional procedures.
2 weeks after the attack, Arlo stood in the same conference room where her reckoning had taken place, but the atmosphere had transformed completely. The table that had once been occupied by corporate executives conducting damage control now hosted representatives from multiple security firms, law enforcement agencies, and tactical training organizations who had come to SportMax with very different intentions. James Mitchell opened the meeting with an announcement that would have been unthinkable just days earlier. Ms. Collins, after extensive consultation with legal counsel, security experts, and public relations specialists, SportMax has decided not only to retain your employment, but to offer you a position that better utilizes your unique capabilities. The transformation in corporate attitude had been driven by factors beyond their control. Media coverage had made Arlo a symbol of competence, triumphing over institutional limitations, with public opinion strongly supporting her actions. More importantly, the investigation had revealed that her previous security concerns, if addressed, might have prevented the attack entirely. Detective Santos, now a permanent part of the discussion, provided the law enforcement perspective. The tactical analysis of the incident has become required training material for our SWAT teams. Ms. Collins' engagement is being studied as a textbook example of civilian defense against professional assault teams. But the real vindication came from Captain Thompson, whose military analysis had initially seemed threatening but had evolved into professional admiration. I've reviewed combat footage from 3 different theaters of operation, and I've rarely seen tactical decision-making under stress that matched what Ms. Collins demonstrated. We'd like to offer her a position as a civilian tactical instructor. The offers had been arriving daily since the story gained national attention. Private security firms wanted to hire her for executive protection assignments. Law enforcement agencies requested consultation on active shooter response protocols. Tactical training companies offered instructor positions that paid more in a month than SportMax paid in a year. Derek Harrison, whose management skills had been indirectly criticized throughout the media coverage, made his own announcement. I've recommended Ms. Collins for promotion to Regional Security Coordinator, with authority to implement the security improvements she's been suggesting for months. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. For 18 months,
Arlo's insights had been dismissed as inappropriate curiosity from someone who didn't understand the complexities of retail security. Now, those same insights were being recognized as expertise that could have prevented the crisis entirely. Sarah Chen addressed the legal resolution with obvious relief. All potential liability issues have been resolved in the company's favor. Ms. Collins's actions are being cited as examples of exemplary employee initiative rather than policy violations. The precedent this creates actually strengthens our legal position for future incidents. But perhaps the most meaningful vindication came from an unexpected source. Jake Morrison, whose condescending attitude had epitomized the dismissive environment that had kept Arlo's capabilities hidden, made a public statement that had been broadcast on multiple news networks. "I spent 18 months thinking I was the weapons expert at SportMax, while the real expert was counting change at Register 4. Arlo Collins taught me that competence doesn't announce itself. It just gets the job done when everything else fails." The young mother whose children had been in the store during the attack had started a social media campaign called #QuietHeroes, highlighting people whose capabilities were overlooked because they didn't match expected stereotypes. The campaign had generated thousands of stories about individuals whose true talents were hidden by assumptions about their roles, backgrounds, or appearances. Rachel, Arlo's co-worker who had gradually distanced herself during the months of growing suspicion, approached her after the formal meeting concluded. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly. "I let other people's doubts influence my opinion of you. When everyone was questioning your focus and dedication, I should have defended you." Arlo's response reflected the wisdom she'd gained through 18 months of deliberate underestimation. "People see what they expect to see. The assumptions that made me invisible also made me effective when effectiveness mattered most." The media attention had created opportunities beyond anything she could have anticipated. Publishers wanted her to write books about tactical preparedness for civilians. Television producers proposed reality shows about hidden expertise in unexpected places. Corporate security consultants offered partnerships that would have made her wealthy while traveling internationally. But Arlo had made her decision during the quiet hours following the attack, when the adrenaline faded and she could assess what mattered most. She accepted SportMax's offer of regional security coordinator, with the understanding that her role would extend far beyond their company to help other retail establishments prepare for threats they never expected to face. 3 months later, Arlo stood in the same briefing room where she'd once been assigned equipment manifests and told to focus on her register duties. But now she was addressing store managers from across the region, teaching them to recognize pre-attack surveillance, implement tactical security procedures, and identify hidden capabilities among their own employees. The most dangerous assumption in security planning is that threats will be obvious and responses will be predictable. Real violence comes from professionals who study your weaknesses while appearing to be ordinary customers. Her training programs had been implemented across multiple retail chains, focusing on threat recognition and tactical response procedures that could be executed by regular employees. The techniques she taught weren't military-level combat skills, but practical awareness and response capabilities that could save lives while staying within legal and corporate constraints. Jake Morrison, now her assistant in the security division, had become one of her most effective advocates. His transformation from dismissive specialist to dedicated student provided a powerful example of how assumptions could be overcome through demonstrated competence. The elderly customer whose grandson had been in the store during the attack made a special trip to attend one of her training sessions. "I want other grandparents to know that heroes don't always look like what we expect," he told the local news crew covering the event. "Sometimes they look like quiet young women who just want to help people stay safe." 6 months after the attack, Arlo received a letter from the Czech Republic that brought her full circle. Her uncle, the private security specialist, had seen the news coverage and wanted her to know how proud her family was of her. "You proved that our training was worthwhile," he wrote. "Not by seeking recognition, but by being ready when readiness mattered." The sporting goods store where she'd once been considered just a cashier now featured a small plaque near the entrance that read, "In appreciation of associate Arlo Collins, whose courage and competence exemplify the difference between following procedures and saving lives." But the real measure of her vindication wasn't in plaques or media attention. It was in the dozens of retail employees who had received tactical awareness training, the security procedures that had been improved based on her recommendations, and the lives that would be saved by preparedness that was once dismissed as unnecessary paranoia. Arlo Collins had spent 18 months proving that size doesn't determine strength, that quiet competence often exceeds loud confidence, and that the most dangerous assumption is believing you know someone's capabilities based on their current role. As she reviewed security footage from stores across the region, looking for the subtle signs of surveillance and threat development that others missed, Arlo smiled at the thought that somewhere, another ordinary employee might be preparing for the moment when extraordinary circumstances would reveal who they really were. The transformation was complete, but the mission continued. Because in a world where threats evolved constantly, the greatest security came from recognizing that heroism often wore the most unremarkable disguises. In the end, they'd called her just a cashier, until 4 seconds of tactical shotgun assembly revealed that assumptions about people's capabilities could be as dangerous as any weapon.